Okay, so we have a very special treat also in the next panel. New York has a long tradition of dairy farming. I know that. I grew up on a dairy farm, as I said earlier, and is additionally poised to be a center of alternative dairy products and proteins. Innovators are situated to meet the ever-widening range of consumer demands while shifting our food system toward net zero goals. How can producers of dairy, meat, and plant protein contribute to a positive sum system? Let's bring our panel to the stage, led by Director of the Northeast Dairy Foods Research Center and Associate Professor at Cornell University. My pleasure to introduce this panel and Sam Elkane. Panel?
Hey everyone, thanks for coming this morning to our symposium talking about the Finding the Common Ground, Traditions and Alternatives in Protein Production. I think, right, it's pretty well, understood, right, that, our climate is changing. We're going to be adding billions of people by 2050, and we really need to think about how we're going to feed all these people in a more sustainable way. And that means we're going to have to think about how we are doing agriculture, right? What kind of changes do we need to make? And that's kind of what this panel here is going to be talking about. Got a great set of experts here from different areas of the industry, and I'm going to introduce them right now. We've got Marcus Lovell-Smith, who is the CEO of Neutral Milk, the first carbon neutral food company in the US, and its mission is to radically reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture for good. We've also got Matthew Sade, who is the former CEO of Kite Hill and CMO of Impossible Foods. And over the last 25 years, he has spent time building disruptive consumer brands that are better for people, animals, and the planet. And lastly, we have Lindsay McCorkle, who is the Director of Ventures and Growth Equity at Blue Horizons. And there she uses her expertise in investing, corporate finance, and strategy to advance a more sustainable food system. So I think we've got a great viewpoint here. And to begin, right, we're here at Grow New York, right, which is a startup competition, and there is a lot of interest, right, in sustainable foods, protein production, alternative proteins, and people have kind of handled that activity in different ways. So I was wondering if, Marcus, we could start with you. Could you talk a little bit about your journey for starting Neutral, and how you got into that idea, and how was building a sustainable dairy company?
Sure, Sam, thank you. Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. Neutral Foods, Neutral Foods Inc. started in 2019 on the premise that there was just a lot of anxiety from folks as to how they could make a difference, and their personal choices in food is a fantastic way to drive change. I think from a Yale study, 54% of Americans are either alarmed or deeply concerned about climate. Well, what do you do about that? So that was the premise. Started in Portland, Oregon, 2019. By 2021, which is actually when I joined the company, and I'll just mention that briefly. 2021, we're in about 30 stores. Now, by the way, we're in just over 2,000 stores across the country. And I got involved through Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is, as some of you may know, is a fund not just backed by Bill Gates, but we know that Bill Gates has become extremely interested and very active in climate investing. And really, I think it was really coupling that idea with, which is one from Breakthrough Energy, that scale matters. If you're going to make a difference, you need to do things at scale. And so otherwise, it's quite frankly, it's all vanity. So if you're going to drive change, and that's why the focus is on big staples. So we've launched a whole milk, organic, pasture-raised, carbon-neutral milk, whole and 2%. We've launched a pasture-raised butter, salted and unsalted. We have other products in there. These are all staples because you can potentially sell a lot of them, and if you sell a lot of them, you end up creating a lot of change. Anyway, so that's how the company, I think that was your question,
yes,
Sam. That's how the company started.
Sorry. Yeah. Great. Matthew, you talk a little bit about your experience with Kite Hill and Impossible Foods and
Sure.
kind of.
Happy to, and thanks for having me at this conference. I'll speak first to Impossible because that, from a chronological order, was sort of first for me. I joined when, and I think I should provide some context. I had founded and run a sustainable meat company in the Western United States. We partnered with the largest cooperative of family ranchers and essentially formed what sort of we talked about as being this necessary third leg of the stool between sort of the growers, the ranchers, the retailers, slash food service operators who were the customers. And they came to the conclusion, we jointly came to the conclusion that there needed to be this third leg, which was a processor, not the processor that's actually processing the animal, but the further processor that was necessary in order to be able to balance the animal, meaning at different times of year, if you want to get really into the weeds on it, you need to be able to sell the whole animal or else you are unprofitable, and that just does not ultimately work for the rancher in this case. So we built a company around that, and I eventually, after 5 years, and that company survives today and is sold in Costco, Safeway, Whole Foods, I eventually just said, hey, listen, I'm challenged by both the economics of this agricultural product as well as, frankly, the challenges of raising animals sustainably, and left the industry, sold the company, and was approached by Pat at Stanford, who said, I'm starting a meat company. And I said, thank you, but I'm done with meat for the moment. And he said, no, it's a different kind of meat company. It's meat from plants. And while we sort of take that for granted right now, at the time, that was not a term people used, and I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he showed me sort of what he was thinking about, and eventually I agreed to join. But that was really about sort of taking what was sort of among the myriad ways that one could try to impact, sort of as Dean Archer said, this impending climate disaster. This was about taking a market-based approach and saying the only way we were going to drive true change is by changing consumer behavior, because 25 years in this industry, and I will tell you, if consumers want sustainable food, manufacturers will find a way to sell it, to make it, and retailers will sell it, period, full stop. And if you can change consumer perception and drive demand, the rest of the supply chain will follow. And that is sort of, I don't know if that's the tail wagging the dog, but the tail is the consumer. And so the idea here was to try to build a company around consumer demand. And Kite Hill was similarly about saying, we know there's been this step function change around alt dairy, and is there a way to try to just create better products? And so similarly, we took that approach to building a plant-based dairy company. I think we've had success there as well.
Right. Well, you talked a little bit about, understanding, right, the consumer's got to want to pull this through. And Lindsay, a lot of your work, right, is figuring out which companies are really going to resonate with consumers and have the technology and the platform to build that. Could you talk a little bit about, when you're looking at investing in startups in this, protein space, sustainability space, what are you looking for, or what are some of the hiccups that you've seen for startup companies?
I think it's been a really tough space to invest in over the last couple of years because we haven't seen consumers demonstrate a huge willingness to pay up for sustainability. There's certainly a segment of the market that's been extremely excited, but as we think about the broad-based consumer and we look at the falling sales of plant-based meat and different sustainability-focused products, especially as inflation increases, it becomes more of a producer-driven solution, I think. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about upstream solutions. Is there a cost-saving technology that is sustainable that can be offered as a B2B solution? Because really, if consumers aren't demonstrating that excitement yet, can it be driven from further upstream? And I think to get producers on board, it has to be cost-saving because there's no one to pass the cost on to quite yet. But I do think we will see consumers more excited over time, but it's definitely a short-term blip as we think about everybody getting more prepared for a recession or everybody really feeling the impact of inflation. But it's it's definitely been a tough couple of years for the industry as we think about what sustainable food means, just given those consumer dynamics.
Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just chime in. So for what it's worth, I spend a lot of my time these days working with the venture community that is looking at investments in plant-based, future food. And what's interesting is I think if you'd asked me 12, 24, 36 months ago, what do I think about the sort of outlook for investment? It's been an incredibly frothy last decade. And I think that we are finally sort of seeing the hangover of too much money being plowed into technologies that frankly are not necessarily worth, they haven't been scientifically vetted, and that married with what we know are the realities of the sort of economy today, are really, I think, right-sizing the venture community, which means valuations are coming down, money is being much, much more scrutinized before it's invested, and companies rightfully are being held to higher standards. They need to not necessarily be profitable because they're startups at the end of the day, and you have to invest in technology development and R&D, but there's an expectation that over time, hopefully you have line of sight to profitability, because there is not the opportunity as there was, for example, when I was at Impossible, to just fund your way to profitability. And that was a nice place to be, and we, truth be told, had the sort of the adoption curve and the growth to support that investment. But that happens very rarely, and it's not commonplace. And so I may digress or differ a little bit from Lindsay in the sense that I disagree about sort of this. There's a lot of chatter, and people love to point at the examples of declining sort of sales of plant-based meat. And the reality is, well, of course, it's expensive. And when the economy's, when food prices are up, those are up as well. And so, sure, you'd expect adoption and customer trial to be down. But I think that, as Lindsay said, this is sort of an intercyclical blip, and that happens. The macro trends will continue, and I think that, when you look at sort of the long arc of this industry, it's very clear where it's going.
Yes, right. So thinking about where it's going, right? So changing ag system, and this kind of gets a little bit more to the title of the talk, right? That we talked a bit about in some of this space, there's been a lot of rhetoric, right, around the change in agriculture, plants versus animals. Where do you see that going? Is there a world or a sustainable agricultural system in the future that has both animal protein and plant protein? Is it weighted one side to the other? What do you think? What does that look like, right? Are we going to be, neutral milk all over the place, or is it going to be, something else?
Okay. Well, I hope we have a lot of neutral milk. And the concept behind neutral foods, and it is not necessarily neutral ourselves, we just happen to be called that, is that there should be a carbon neutral foods aisle in these grocery stores and available. I think I see there's room for both. I mean, the reality is something like 93% of American households have dairy in their refrigerator. So that's where Americans are today, and that's where we're meeting them. So we have to address animal agriculture, and everything that we're involved in at Neutral is in animal proteins, because if you look at them, the sort of the map of the $860 billion U.S. Retail grocery sales, 3/4 of it, maybe 80% of that relates to animal proteins, either directly or through the row crops that are necessary to feed them. So 80% of the climate impact relates to animal agriculture. So we have to address that. I'm actually very pro the alternative protein world. I see it as a proxy. I talked about 54% of Americans being alarmed or deeply concerned. I mean, they're reaching for it. And I think, and moving it slightly away from the sort of the pure venture and financial side of things, there's just this, almost on a philosophical basis, there's 54% of Americans that are alarmed or deeply concerned, and I think it may be north of that number now. And yet there's an a huge action-intention gap. And we all know what we say and what we do are two entirely different things. And we're all very fallible individuals. How do you close that gap? And I think part of it comes down to the sense of powerlessness, which is really where neutral started, was the sense that people wanted to be able to do something but feel that they can't. And I think I may have said this before to you, Sam, but you know, if you're an individual, how do you deal with maritime shipping or aviation fuel? Or, I mean, you have no, but with food, you really have an ability to drive change. And I think the challenge for the brands and challenge for us is how we go out and actually convince consumers that they have a visceral connection with the farmers that we work with. And then we've done a good job. And I think we can do that because there's that action-intention gap. And our job is to close it, and I don't think the brands have yet done a good enough job.
Right. More space to do there, building that link. Yeah, I agree, and that's kind of what we're trying to do with the Grow New York region. But yeah. Thoughts from you, Matthew, on...
Yeah, of course. So, you know, I think there's, at the end of the day, I think that this is going to take, we need to have a range of arrows in our quiver, period, full stop. I mean, at the end of the day, this is not a sort of alt versus traditional dairy or alt versus traditional industrial agriculture battle. This is about finding solutions to this, as you know, as Dean Archer said, this issue, this climate catastrophe that is bearing down on us. And I think for anybody, be it on the traditional animal agriculture side or anybody trying to take a novel approach to addressing it, you have to think differently about what you do day in and day out. There are things, as Marcus is sort of, you know, has discussed as an example that Neutral is doing when we, that are very, very helpful as it relates to sort of, you know, giving people what they want. And today that is, you know, that's milk. You know, it's milk from cows by and large. And that's not going to change anytime soon. You ask me in 50 years, I'll probably have a very, very different answer. You can't help but look at 54% are dramatically concerned. 60% of U.S. households are participating in some kind of an alt protein category. By and large, that's milk today, right? Much smaller percentage of it, it's meat, and in a smaller percentage, yet again, it's cheese. And that is directly correlated to the quality of the products, and not that food is technology, but the technology, you know, I use milk as an example, 20% market share. I mean, that's an amazing statistic. 20% of the milk category is now alt milk, and that is driven, it's a step function change. It was soy, then driven by one or two key brands, almond, and you saw a huge spike in household penetration because it delivered on consumer expectations. I mean, I do believe that food is cultural. It has so much tied up in it that to the extent that you can deliver on what people want from an organoleptic experience, then they can get past the fact that this maybe didn't come from the same place as their original milk, but this certainly satisfies all of those conscious and subconscious needs. And then there was another spike recently around oat, where, again, creaminess, frothiness, all the good stuff people want from their milk. Now, is it cow's milk? Absolutely not. Is Impossible beef? No. I mean, I'll be the first to tell you, you know, anybody who eats meat can break off a piece of that, not with a bun, and, two pickles, lettuce, onion, cheese on a sesame seed bun. It does not taste like beef, but you know what? It tastes good enough for the people who really do want to make a change, sort of move in that direction. And so my point is simply, I think we have convergence happening. And the more that we move in that direction, and the more that the people on the traditional ag side are saying, how can I do what we need to do? The ranchers we worked with at my prior company were people who were putting in all of the types of environmental initiatives and projects on the farm and on the ranch that allowed them to be able to keep pace with the needs of not just their customer, the retailer and the food service operator, but also their end consumer. And so I think it's going to take both sides doing what they can ultimately to try to help address this problem, or we're going to slowly sort of lose this battle.
Yes, right. Do you have any thoughts then on what the future might look like?
Sure. I mean, I think it takes both, right? And I think to say it will be all or one is pretty short-sighted, just because there are, as Matthew said, emotional ties to food and cultural ties to food. But I think another thing is, what is the performance and what needs are these products fulfilling? Because the fluid milk sales were down before the emergence of alt milks. And so then you look at the holes that alt milks filled, and people are putting them in smoothies now. People are pouring them into cereal. And in addition to people liking the frothiness of oat milk, they like that oat taste, or they like the almond taste, or they like what soy is delivering. And so they're not asking it to act exactly as a dairy substitute. Where it's been harder to create penetration is where they're saying, I want this to taste just like butter, because everyone knows what true dairy butter tastes like and how it performs. So I think there are different components that we can fulfill, and different needs that can be met with different products. And it'll be interesting to see how the animal protein category and the all protein category, can they meet different consumer needs and wants by filling different holes rather than competing so directly, is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Right. Talking about then the consumer wants and needs, you talked a little, Matthew, about the step change in flavor and quality and things like that. Is that really what's holding back these alternative proteins from bigger adoption in the market? Or is it, I guess, resistance to the technology, right? So like we talk about, things like Impossible, right? Where there is, right, the heme protein that's engineered. What is the consumer response to that? Is it that at the end of the day, taste and cost trump everything? Or is there some other hurdles? Yeah.
I think it's somewhat demographically driven. Younger consumers are less averse to heavy tech-oriented products, but there's not a compelling proposition for consumers to buy these products right now, in my opinion, because the taste isn't good enough, and they're more expensive, and they're not necessarily easier to say this is much healthier. It's, research is coming along. So what's the value proposition as a consumer for me to go into a store and pay a premium for a product that I have uncertainties around in terms of, I don't know how to prepare this, I don't know if it will taste good. So until the products are better across the board in a few categories, I think it's hard to convince consumers, particularly in an economic climate like right now. So I think we have definitely some progress to make in terms of product quality, but also in terms of things like cost.
I would just add to that. I generally agree with Lindsay. The issue of prices, at the end of the day, is significant. Products have to be ideally at parity to their traditional counterparts. And we're not there yet from a scale and a technology standpoint. At the same time, I would say I generally don't think the American consumer really is that concerned about sort of where my food comes from, by and large, on a mass scale. Okay. I think that sort of very, very sort of food-involved individual, and they're younger, and they do want to know where it comes from, and they're voting their dollars with their values, which is a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that's a very small percentage of the population. When you start getting into sort of mainstream consumers, frankly, it usually comes down to taste and price, yes. Right. What's interesting is that there's also a segment which is sort of close into that, which is saying, it's got to taste good, and I'm willing to pay more if I can, but usually it's not because I'm voting for the environment with my dollars, but rather it's all about personal health. Yep. Maybe your doctor has told you, hey, you need to cut back on your red meat and on your cholesterol, and those are people that are very eager to try this product, and they seek it out. Certainly you've got restrictive diets that are sort of moving quickly into this category, yep. But at the end of the day, people, by and large, know we have this sort of existential issue and around climate change, but they're not really willing to put their money where their mouth is. Right. And that's a problem.
Oh, right.
There was a really interesting study, just to follow that up, out of University of Chicago that discussed what percentage tax would have to be levied on animal protein products to get them to buy alternative protein products, and it was 40%. And so that's, in addition to reversing government subsidies, that's an additional 40% cost. And so it is fascinating to see the stickiness to meat, and it also proves people don't necessarily think about if this is from a factory farm or it's sustainably raised. People just like what they like or buy what they know.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. There's a group that that actually Marcus is also familiar with and referenced, Breakthrough Energy, a group out of they're a national investor and participate with Neutral. And they talk about the green premium, and that is to say, what is the cost above its sort of, animal-based or the traditional form, be it fossil fuels, animal protein, cow milk. What is the premium that a consumer is being asked today to pay? And that green premium really drives ultimately the long-term success of the category. And their goal is to say, we need to bring that green premium down.
Right.
And if we can do that, then we believe we have a real shot at sort of driving consumer adoption and category growth.
Okay. Well, talking about that premium, Marcus, on the animal side, right? When we're talking about improving the sustainability practices of dairies, that usually has a cost to it, right, for the producer. So how do you balance that cost with then driving consumer adoption of more sustainably grown animal?
Absolutely, because we spend money directly, and we don't just spend money. It's partly money. It's also just as much expertise and advice. So we spend a lot. And we tend to work with farms in the sort of 150 to 250 cow, or 100 cow to 250 cow. The sort of smaller family farms. There's never a shortage of projects to do with farmers. I mean, one of the things that we've learned, and I've learned very early, you certainly don't go on a farm and tell them what to do, because then it becomes a very short conversation.
This is short, right?
But we work with farms. I think the green premium, I think there is necessary. There has to be a green premium, and our research says there is one for neutral milk, and we are currently priced in the middle of the market for sort of organic, pasture-raised milks, and our consumer research says there is a green premium. We're not quite sure yet how big that is.
Yes, right.
But also part of, and you may describe this as naive, but I kind of the company is on a path trying, if you like, almost to decommoditize milk. And if you like, we've all been complicit. Mm-hmm. We've all swept along the aisle and picked up the 2-gallon jug. And so consumers are complicit, and retailers are complicit, and processors are complicit, and even farmers are complicit in that. And we've driven this incredible food, to a ridiculously low price, this staple. And part of what we're trying to do is educate consumers and say, no, this is an extraordinary thing going on here in small farms across America, generally for small farms, though not exclusively. And you can make a difference, and that seems pretty exciting to me. And the other thing is possibly some of the subsidies also tend to benefit the larger farms and the lower price, and it's kind of a race to the bottom. So, milk is an extraordinary product and an incredibly nutritious product. I happen to think it tastes better than many of the current alternative products. Though, as Matthew and Lindsay says, they're on a path to improving. I actually think it's more nutritious, and I'm a strong believer in ruminants being part of a holistic farming system.
Right.
I mean, they've always been here, and they should always be there. But actually, I'm a milk company, or we're a milk company, and we want to sell an enormous amount of milk in order to create an enormous amount of change. But actually, I do believe in a lower consumption of animal products. I think the average American eats 209 pounds of animal-related proteins and fats and sugars a year, and the average European is not far behind that, about 160 to 180. I suspect that number is long-term unsustainable. It's just unsustainable. So I'm a milk company that wants to sell milk, but actually believes in perhaps a lower consumption of milk. There's some paradoxes here that are complicated. This is a complicated issue.
Right? So yeah, higher quality, less volume, more value.
And also nutritious. I mean, we always talk about bushels and we talk about gallons. We never talk about nutritious. We don't talk about the omega-6, omega-3 ratios. We don't talk about conjugated linoleic acid. We don't talk about the vitamin. And if you look at the nutrient quality of many of the modern foods, they're so much lower than they were. Yeah. They're not like 20% lower. In many of these cases, they're 200%, 300% in many of these sort of phytochemical areas. So I think part of this is also an understanding of the value of the nutrient. We're not, it's not the calories we're worried about. It's the sort of underlying phytochemicals.
Right. So the nutrition, and that almost plays to that kind of health, right, call for the consumer, right, on how do I eat healthy and what is the right healthy choice. Now, can you talk a little bit then about that with, some of the alternative, right, products, plant-based products? There is, right, some of those differences on protein quality, holistic whole foods, right, which dairy is, right, with its, mineral content, its vitamin content. How are companies trying to address that on the, alternative protein side of things to make a whole food and not just, one macro component of meat?
Yeah, sure. So I think that what we're talking about is this idea of nutritional equivalency, and that's become sort of a big topic in the alt plant, the alt protein world. And what I would tell you is that there are, by and large, sort of a new standard out there, which is that if you are playing largely in one of these categories, you want to aspire to nutritional equivalency. Now, obviously, it starts with a macronutrient profile, by and large. Right? You want
they talk a lot about protein, fats, carbs.
Yeah, and this sort of goes to my earlier point that the sort of consumer drives ultimately both what is sold and what in turn is produced, right? People want high protein, so the primary macronutrient that people are looking at is protein, because that seems to be what the American consumer thirsts for right now, cannot get enough protein. Right or wrong, I think there's a lot of people who would tell you we have way too much protein in our diet, we just don't need it, and by and large, most of that leaves us as quickly as it entered us.
Right.
So putting that sort of aside, nutritional equivalency is important, right? Leaving aside sort of the cholesterol and some of the saturated fat that you frankly don't want. Micronutrient, phytonutrient, absolutely. Those are things that I think we don't fully understand, sort of the role they play and the sort of the effect of them sort of on each other, as well as in this larger sort of holistic product.
Yeah.
But certainly, I think the alt protein companies are trying to aspire to be as inclusive of these as they possibly can. But I think to Marcus's point, it's going to be very hard to replicate anything that was created by those ruminants, feeding on these sort of completely diverse sort of ecosystems. And so, is it possibly, is it seen as an inferior product? It could be. I think in some cases it absolutely is, and I think the milk is a perfect example. There are some companies that have protein equivalency and equivalency across a range of macro and micro, but sort of the rest of that I just don't think we fully understand.
Yeah.
I think there's two other points that I think are interesting to make. Is there's always this sort of comment about highly processed foods. But what's interesting, and this may just, I don't say this because, I say this because I think it's worth sort of thinking about, is the idea that we are growing animals who feed on plants, feeding on plants, growing these animals, slaughtering the animals to eat to eat the meat, the cow, the proverbial cow as the factory, to give us the protein, as opposed to just saying, why aren't we taking the plants and creating that same end product and bypassing the ruminant and the enteric fermentation step, which is probably the single largest sort of detriment to global warming right now. It begs the question, which is the highly processed food? The one that went through the cow or the cattle, or the one that just went right from plant to meat, to protein source? Assuming that at the end of the day, the two are identical and you can't tell the difference from an organoleptic standpoint. And the other thing I would just simply add is this: we talk a lot about climate change, and I keep referencing sort of Dean Asher, and I'm sure Dean Holden and everyone else, will say the same thing. We have this problem, but the other problem that is a part of this is the idea that feeding a growing global population is not possible if we just stay the course, period, full stop.
Right.
We
have to make
we just can't keep doing this. So
Yep.
it's, that is why we are here. That is why we are seeking alternative options.
That's right. Question for you. We're talking about the micronutrient profiles and things like that. And we talked a little bit about what does the world look like? Is there an opportunity though, because I always feel like it's either the silo is alternative protein or it's animal protein or dairy. Are there opportunities for combining the two to then extend it? Like, so I think about it, I do a lot of research on dairy byproducts and how we can upcycle them. So they're really rich, right, in those minerals, those vitamins, right? Is there an opportunity to combine those, right, that come out of, say, Greek yogurt production and then combine it with alternative proteins to make value-added products that deliver the best of both worlds? Do we see that happening, or is that still very much everyone is playing in their own spaces? Yeah.
So DFA tried a blended milk last year, 2 years ago, and so it was a dairy oat blend. So things that are that simplistic don't go so well. I think part of it is consumer confusion. They expect it to be plant-based, or they expect it to be animal, and anything between is like, I'm just trying to buy my groceries. Let's make this as simple as possible. But I think it's really fascinating, particularly as we look at the benefits of whey protein and how digestible it is, particularly with aging population, and you look at that massive dynamic going on. I'm excited by the potential to combine waste streams and byproducts. However, I think everything has to be consumer driven. So if there's consumer understanding of what the products are, or there's consumer demand, it makes sense. But right now it's still pretty simplistic in terms of, is this animal or is this non-animal? And I think we still have to clean that up a little bit. And cultivated meat or cultivated products might do some of that work for us.
Right.
But I think it's probably a little bit too early for blended products.
There actually was also, I think it was Tyson who launched a blended...
Raised and rooted,
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Raised and rooted. It was a blended meat product line, sort of part plant, part animal, with an eye towards saying, here's a sort of stepping stone between here and there. Ultimately, they discontinued it, likely for the same reason.
I love that stepping stone analogy, because I think that's exactly where I think we should go. I mean, I could almost say, this is maybe a slightly contentious point, that the highly processed plant-based meat alternative is a proxy, almost a short-term proxy. It's a response to that climate anxiety by people who want to do better. But is it really a long-term problem? And what we should be looking for maybe down the road is just a more sustainable, more nutrient-rich diet with probably substantially lower animal proteins in it overall. Guess what? It's probably much closer to an original healthy diet anyway. And I think, so we may do on a stepping stone, these may be stepping stones to that. So we may not be demanding something that with heme protein that looks exactly like a beef burger in future. We may say, we maybe just want one of those a week rather than 2 a day. And I think that would be my hope, that we would end up with a more holistic diet,
yeah.
But also, guess what? A more holistic agricultural system with more mixed cropping, with more mixed animals, and with greater levels of biodiversity. I mean, though we are a carbon neutral business, it's in the name.
Right. Yeah.
Everything we do is correlated with biodiversity, nutrient management, animal welfare, and even the thorny issue of rural equity. I mean, these all things are incredibly correlated, and we have to fix. Guess what? We have to fix them all. And I thought I was just starting a carbon neutral business. No. It's even bigger than that.
Yeah. On that, that kind of future of a more diverse, plant system, animal system, business side. What are some of the challenges, with some of the alternative protein work that's out there? It seems like there's a lot of tech that's required, right, in the upfront. So how does that sustain, will there be small to mid-sized businesses that are playing in that space, or does that become another set of large companies like, the Cargills and, of the world? How does that play out in your experience?
I think it will take both. I think the most interesting and exciting companies I've seen have been able to figure out a way to partner with an ADM or a Cargill to take advantage of whether it's their fermentation capacity or some of their distribution or their scale-up support. I think it's going to be really, just because the CapEx required to get to scale, doing it on your own is massively expensive, and quite frankly, venture funds aren't built to provide that kind of capital. So I think there's going to have to be a lot of creative financing solutions in the event that the partnerships don't work out. But I would also say that as we use the word tech, we have to be a little bit cautious, because as Matthew said up front, we use the word tech after everything, and everybody thinks you're worth, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars just by virtue of having that word. So it becomes, as we think about how much tech is currently used in dairy, can we use some of that for alt protein? And what can we leverage that already exists to help build these companies into truly scalable businesses?
It's interesting. I would just echo this idea that, by and large, the biggest companies don't invest in far-reaching sort of blue sky R&D. Right. The kinds of things that roll out of universities where you've got a visionary, be it a Pat Brown or any of the other founders that sort of said, I'm not going to stop until I figure this out. Yeah. Big companies, publicly traded companies that have quarterly earnings requirements, won't invest behind blue sky long-term in R&D. It has to be tied to revenue. It has to be tied by and large to volume. But what they do have, and to Lindsay's point, is this capacity, and that is why we're seeing these partnerships take place. AB InBev, which has seen sort of a downturn of traditional sort of beer, as opposed to that it's lost to the craft brewery category, is now doing a deal with the Every company to use their tanks for precision fermentation of egg-based albumin, so of alternative albumin. So really creative partnerships for the very reason that Lindsay's talking about. It's interesting. I spent the day yesterday at Cornell and met with a range of different companies, and there is so much exciting innovation coming out of the labs. And by and large, 3 out of the 3 companies that I spent with are quickly coming up against this challenge of the need for CapEx to build not even a full-scale production facility, but just a pilot facility to be able to say, how do we transfer what we're doing from the benchtop to a live commercial environment just to prove this out at a slightly larger scale? And the cost to do that is not insignificant. Yeah. Heaven forbid they would want to then commercialize it in a meaningful way. You're talking about tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of CapEx. Right. The venture community doesn't pay for that. So, it's a very, very different funding environment. So I think there's a group that have to go out there and develop the hard R&D and the science, and then it really becomes, to some extent, a game of project finance, and that's where I think public-private partnership is going to be very important to scaling these technologies, just as it was in the electrical vehicle industry.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Maybe I could say what's a slightly controversial thing about technology. I do think technology is absolutely vital, and I'm a major advocate of it. But if you split the climate impact into the sort of 5 great pillars, which includes buildings, transportation, energy, manufacturing, and then the 5th great pillar, of course, is food and agricultural systems. Maybe the largest pillar. The numbers move around, but the first 4 are entirely human-made issues, and therefore technology is exactly the right way to approach the grid, lithium batteries, electric vehicles, cement, iron and steel. Food and ag is a natural system and is wildly more complex. So all I would say is we have to be so much more humble about the approaches we take in food and ag. And so what does that mean? And I think it means that we just have to be more thoughtful about the things we do there. Maybe we have to sometimes even step back and wait. It's a knowledge, great agriculture, I think, is a knowledge-based system. And I don't know whether this is relevant to this group, but America's lost 50 million people from agricultural communities, and true from here over since the 1930s. Okay, so and everyone assumes that is progress, and it is progress. But was it inevitable? Maybe, maybe not. But what people don't say is that 50 million people with a kind of almost indigenous intelligence, field, not just farm by farm, but field by field intelligence. So if you like, the AI, to put it in modern terms, the machine learning has just walked off the farm. And I think what would be kind of wonderful is how to, I'm not suggesting we bring 50 million people back to rural economies, so that would be spectacular. But somehow we have to bring that knowledge back, that knowledge, not necessarily products and systems and tech always, though tech is a part of it. Yep. But it's this, again, it's almost a philosophical point. How do you bring that knowledge back so that those farms are holistic, sustainable, productive, not in a kind of bucolic 19th century view of the world, but in a modern way, with the very best of what we can offer, the very best of science. But it's about knowledge, not necessarily about products and systems. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. It's the inherent knowledge of the environment, right, and the animals, and how to improve that from that base, rather than just coming in with a large tech that wipes it out. Yeah.
I mean, I see those farmers who left the land as deep databases of generational knowledge about why that field worked and why that field didn't work.
Right. Well then, this has been a great discussion. I know we have a crowd out here, and we've got I wanted to open up to see if there are any questions for our panelists around this space on alternative proteins and dairy sustainability. If there are, we have a mic passing around the room. So if you've got a question, I'll let people kind of move on out.
We have some questions that have already been submitted. And
oh, wow.
I'm going to start firing off now if you guys are ready. All right. Animal protein could be premiumized, livestock carbon emissions can be managed, and small to mid-sized producers can maintain high animal welfare standards. What measures can the alternative protein sector take to minimize carbon impact, increase sustainability, and encourage biodiversity, and on what timeline?
See a question there on, I guess it's more than towards the animal proteins.
What measures could you say that again?
Yeah. What measures can the alternative protein sector take to minimize carbon impact, increase sustainability, and encourage biodiversity, and on what timeline?
Yeah, so I think with regard to the first two, carbon emissions and sustainability, that's sort of inherent in the DNA of the company and why they exist. If you look at most, certainly Impossible is an example, and the one I'm most familiar with, I think the numbers are something like 90% less water, 90% less sort of land. I mean, it's staggering the sustainability that's baked into the DNA of the company and the products. Does it address the issue of biodiversity? Not yet, certainly. But I think that what they would tell you is sourcing sort of non-GMO inputs. Yes, that would be a nice to have. Ultimately, being able to sort of address this issue of biodiversity. I'm not sure what they would do there, because it sort of runs counter to sort of the idea of, if we're going to drive costs down, we need to sort of have more efficient inputs. But I think that's a big question around biodiversity. I don't think that these companies today are doing that. And that's a shortcoming for sure. I think, though, that, I think that the idea of addressing sustainability, climate change, the environment, those are why these companies exist. And if you're not familiar with the numbers around how they compare to traditional livestock, you can find those very easily. But it's a very staggering comparison. Yeah, I don't know if either of them, no.
Agree.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Lindsay, I have one for you. We formerly saw buoyant projections for alternative meat plummet this year. Lindsay, what do you think the dominant issue was? Price, taste, product visibility, habit?
Oh, everything. I think, first of all, the prices continue to be too high. Second of all, during that first period where we saw sales increase, a lot of it was novelty buys. There was not a lot of repeat purchasing. So what that says to me is the products didn't taste good, or people had confusion about how to prepare it, or didn't have a good experience. Because what we did see on the backdrop of that is increased distribution. So we had increased distribution and still falling sales. there was not a lot of product innovation over the last 2 years. I think a lot of the innovation is being led by earlier stage companies that consumers don't yet have broad access to. So things should get better over time, but we just didn't see the repeat purchases that we needed to see, which led to sales that were down 11%. Volumes were about flat, but sales were down quite a bit. So even with those promotions, it's been, even within the last week, Kellogg's, Maple Leaf, and Beyond have all reported double-digit revenue falls. So we're going to continue to see that until the products meet consumer needs.
Yeah, I would just add on that. I think that I'd sort of challenge this idea of plummeting. I don't see, frankly, sub 20% declines, even 11% by volume. I was going to say, I think it was, depending on which company you look at, it was not significant, but fairly in kind with sort of the broader protein, frankly, trends. I think it's important to point out that the way that we sort of segment the industry, you've got sort of legacy brands that are owned by some of the big multinationals, and then you've got a couple of standout brands that really, I think, are more representative of the sort of technology and the quality, which, as we've talked about, is what really drives consumer adoption and behavior. And I think that Beyond and Impossible are sort of the two companies that are by and far seen as sort of the front runners, as being sort of the best quality product in the market today. Private, but Peter McGinnis, the CEO of Impossible, has publicly stated that the company is up 60% year over year. I think part of that is because it's heavily weighted toward food service and less so retail. Beyond is more heavily retail focused and less so food service. I think you would also say that and for that reason, I would also suggest that Beyond is down a bit. I think it's easy to sort of jump on the alt protein sector is down, and it's, we sort of knew it was going to happen sooner or later. Again, I think that when you look at the fact that every major meat company in the world, JBS exiting Ozo as their brand, exiting that facility and that brand, including that concept, that comment, I would still tell you every major meat company in this industry is heavily investing in the future of alt protein, period, bar none. And it's not because they think that alt protein is a sham. They recognize where this industry is going. They realize that in 20, 30, 40 years, this is going to be a major part of this category, and they have to innovate, and that's why they're doing this. I think that when you have publicly traded companies that are the subject of intense short-term pressure, they make short-term decisions, and shutting a brand down or a plant down, which frankly is a subpar product and underperforming, that's a smart business decision. But they will continue to invest in this category because they ultimately see that they want to be the ones to cannibalize themselves if they're going to be cannibalized.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more quick one.
Yeah.
How may consumer behavior be swayed towards alternative protein without offending animal food producers?
I don't think it has to be one or the other. Again, I think it's what alternatives can you present that make it attractive to consumers. So it becomes what value proposition do you have that animal protein doesn't have? And I'm of the mindset you don't have to tell people you should never eat meat. Can you swap out meat 2 nights a week, 3 nights a week? Because that would position us much better, by the way, from a carbon emissions perspective. So it becomes what can you give the consumer that they can't get from chicken or beef or pork right now? And that's a long list of things, but it doesn't necessarily have to be you're getting all from either food group.
Yeah. I mean, I would also say it's already happening. Our own research shows there's an incredible amount of overlap of families that have alternative milks and dairy milks in the same. It's incredible. I mean, the numbers surprise me. So it's already happening. So consumers are okay with that blend. So it's happening.
I would just add, at the end of the day, this is a market-driven economy, and people want choice, and ultimately it's about giving people choice and educating them. If you open up my fridge right now, you'll see I have a half gallon of neutral which, by the way, I got on sale. You'll see a half gallon of organic whole milk, and you'll see a half gallon of oat milk. And that just reflects sort of my household. And the same thing, you'll see a cube of Impossible sitting next to a cube of organic grass-fed beef from Costco. Because I've got people in my house who refuse to eat animal protein, and I've got people in my house who refuse to eat plant-based dairy, or plant-based, period, are very suspect of the whole category.
Yeah. And I think, right,
I think that's the marketplace.
That's the
There you go. Like, I just have to sit around the table and ask my children what they think.
And really, then maybe that's the outlook for the future, right? It is still going to be a blended production system in the future, right? Where we will have a place for animal agriculture, we're going to have a place for novel protein production systems, and what that balance will look like is, you're right, is anybody's guess. But I think it's rest assured that both of these will be around for a long time. And we're not reinventing the way we eat. So. With that, I want to thank the panelists, Marcus, Matthew, Lindsay, thank you for coming. And I'd like to thank the audience for coming to the symposium. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and the pitches. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.